Have you ever looked at a news story, maybe about some huge institutional failure, and just thought, how how did this even happen? How did everyone just miss the signs?
Hmm.
Or maybe you've seen, I don't know, a public figure's behavior, something that just feels really off, but somehow it's widely accepted, maybe even admired.
Yeah, it's baffling sometimes.
What if these situations that seem so confusing, what if they aren't just isolated incidents? What if they're symptoms of something deeper, something we all kind of overlook?
That's a really important question.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into how these distorted ways of behaving get sort of ingrained in us, not through genetics, right, but through something profound, often invisible, systemic psychological negligence.
Exactly. It's pervasive but often unnamed.
Our mission here is to really unpack it. How are these norms absorbed, sometimes right from childhood? And how do big institutions, maybe without even meaning to, reinforce them? How does it get passed down?
Uh-huh. Across generations.
And, yeah, what does it all mean for us, for society? We've pulled together a lot of sources, research papers, some really eye-opening case studies.
It's quite a stack.
Yeah. And they all seem to point towards this idea that collectively we can kind of misremember what healthy behavior even looks like, almost like a societal Mandela effect, you know?
That's a great way to put it. A collective forgetting, almost. What's really fascinating is how these patterns hide in plain sight.
Right. So you can expect some surprising connections today. We'll look at, well, everything from how childhood trauma can be tragically mistaken for, say, developmental disorders,
Which happens more than you'd think.
to the sneaky ways manipulative tactics echo through our work lives, maybe in law enforcement or, I don't know, even just a customer service call.
It shows up everywhere.
It really does. So it's a journey to understand these invisible chains that tie us to these patterns, and crucially, maybe figure out how we can start to break them.
That's the goal. Understanding is the first step.
Okay, so let's unpack this fundamental idea. Children internalize what they observe. It seems basic enough.
It is. But the implications are huge.
And that brings us to something called the DARVO tactic. That stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender.
A classic manipulation strategy.
Yeah, abusers use it to dodge accountability.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really unsettling, looking at our sources, is how kids in environments with abuse or maybe just serious neglect, they can actually be, like, trained to echo the abuser's narrative.
Yes. Becoming unwitting accomplices, in a way.
How does that actually take hold? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's a pretty profound process. Research on what's called coercive control in families, it shows that kids can effectively be weaponized. They might be pushed to make false claims like parental alienation against the parent who's actually trying to protect them. So what happens is the child learns pretty quickly to deny reality or even invert it, usually to please the dominant, often abusive figure in their life. And this normalizes dishonesty. It normalizes misplaced blame as survival strategies really early on.
That sounds like it fundamentally rewires how a child sees the world. It must.
It absolutely does.
And that leads to another really striking point you mentioned earlier, this idea that without a trauma-informed evaluation, professionals might label a kid as, say, autistic or hyperactive when the root cause is something completely different.
Right. The symptoms can overlap superficially.
Our sources have this powerful example. A young boy, he had PTSD from abuse. He was nearly misdiagnosed with autism because he was withdrawn, kind of rigid. His play was very repetitive.
Which can look like autistic traits, exactly.
But eventually, clinicians figured out his behavior, like he kept reenacting a mother protecting kids from a monster. In his play, it was driven by the trauma he'd lived through, not autism. It just makes you wonder, how often does this happen?
And it raises that critical question, are we actually addressing the root cause, or are we just putting a label on symptoms? This kind of diagnostic confusion, it's really a form of psychological negligence.
Yeah.
And the tragedy is the child often internalizes that mislabel. They don't get the right support, their real pain isn't seen, and that masked behavior, the coping mechanism, just gets more entrenched.
And the impact of this goes way beyond just individual cases, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of unsettling how society sometimes seems to celebrate the very traits we normally think are negative.
Oh, definitely.
Our sources point this out. There's a documented trend of glorifying what are basically sociopathic tendencies. You know, ruthlessness, manipulativeness, a lack of empathy, framing them as markers of success.
Right, like it's aspirational.
How does a child absorb that? How do they internalize such a dangerous redefinition of normal?
It's definitely a learned response. I mean, imagine a kid whose heroes, maybe a famous CEO, a celebrity, even a parent, routinely exploit others, and show no remorse.
Yeah.
That child learns to mimic it. And studies actually show empathy levels dropping among adolescents in some places, while narcissistic traits seem to be rising. Society's messages can subtly imply that empathy is, weak, and that being aggressive or self-centered is what gets you ahead.
So in a family context.
Exactly. If a parent has untreated issues, maybe trauma or sociopathic traits, and they lash out impulsively or lie constantly, the child grows up seeing that as just normal emotional regulation. Over time, these aggressive or deceitful behaviors can become their accepted baseline for how people act.
No, so it's really becoming clear these behaviors are absorbed, not innate, like a social contagion almost.
Yeah,
Deeply ingrained ways of coping.
precisely.
So that makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what happens when these patterns, maybe shared by a lot of people in one generation, hit our big institutions? Do our systems, like schools or courts, correct these distortions?
Wow.
Or do they end up reinforcing them?
Unfortunately, it seems, all too often, our systems reinforce them. Take educational systems. If they aren't trauma-informed, they can easily become breeding grounds for these same dysfunctional norms.
How so?
Well, think about a child acting out because of abuse at home. If the school just punishes them as bad, it reinforces for that child, and maybe their classmates too, the idea that aggression is just met with more aggression. It doesn't address the root cause at all.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark thought. And you mentioned a really tragic case in Colombia earlier. Could you tell us a bit more about how the institutional failure happened there?
Absolutely. It was a horrifying situation, really. In Bogota, in a state-supervised childcare center called Hogar Infantil Corinto, a teacher there tortured and abused at least 18 children for years.
Oh my God, for years.
Yes. And the institution responsible for oversight, ICBF, the Colombian Institute for Family Welfare, was found to have incurred grave failures in its duty of care and supervision. They basically allowed this abuse to continue unchecked.
So what does that teach the children involved?
It teaches them a truly perverse and damaging lesson, that the people in charge, the authorities, can harm you and get away with it. It normalizes being a victim and completely destroys any trust in authority. When you connect that to the bigger picture, it's institutional failure on a massive scale.
And it seems this isn't just limited to education. It extends to psychological and medical institutions, too.
It does.
Our sources brought up the really controversial use of parental alienation in custody battles, where, an abusive parent claims the child's fear isn't because of the abuse, but because the other parent alienated them.
It's a common tactic.
And a 2024 study actually found that 44%, almost half, of accused abusers in these cases got or kept access to their kids by using unverified alienation claims.
It's staggering.
It really sounds like GRVO,
Right.
but on a systemic level. Weaponizing jargon to just flip the blame entirely.
It absolutely is. Researcher Jennifer Furds actually coined a term for this: institutional DARVO. That's when the organization itself, the court, the agency, whatever, denies the victim's reality and attacks them, basically to protect the offender or the institution's reputation.
Wow.
And it's an especially harmful form of what she calls institutional betrayal. It inflicts a second trauma on the victim, and it sends this chilling message out that, truth and justice can just be subverted.
Can you give other examples?
Sure. Think about police maybe charging a rape victim with lying, or schools trying to silence whistleblowers who report abuse. These actions tell victims your experience doesn't count, and you can't trust people in power.
That pattern even shows up in law enforcement and justice systems themselves, which is really concerning.
It is.
Our sources pointed to a systemic failure in detecting manipulative, coercive behaviors during police screening processes. Like the standard psychological exams often just don't screen for that DARVO type manipulation or narcissistic traits.
They're often not designed for it.
And the result. An estimate suggests that maybe 5 to 8% of officers in some departments could have profiles compatible with coercive manipulation. In a medium-sized department, that's like 17 to 32 officers.
Which is significant.
And we see examples, right? Florida had cases like a county sheriff lying about a past homicide investigation he was involved in, a deputy covering up domestic abuse, officers falsifying reports.
The list goes on, unfortunately.
So when this kind of behavior exists within law enforcement, what does that actually mean for the community they're supposed to serve?
Well, it means you can end up with a policing culture that gaslights victims. It fundamentally erodes community trust. And here's the really concerning part. These blind spots, these failures, they aren't just local issues. They can get exported globally. For example, programs funded by USAID and run by places like Florida International University in Columbia, they've supported training in justice reform. But if those training programs carry the same institutional paradigms, the same lack of awareness about DARVO or coercive profiles, then the dysfunction gets reinforced internationally, not challenged.
It just highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it?
Yep.
Even global NGOs and government programs, they're not immune.
Not at all.
Child protection agencies like the ICBF in Colombia we mentioned, or Florida's Department of Children and Families, DCF, even though they're part of these larger networks, they've had major systemic negligence issues.
Absolutely.
The Nubia Barahona case in Florida back in 2011 is just heartbreaking. A 10-year-old girl tortured and murdered despite so many abuse reports that were just ignored. A caseworker apparently even falsely reported the home was safe.
It was a catastrophic failure.
And it took huge public outrage and external legal action to even start forcing changes in the system.
That case, sadly, is a perfect illustration that institutional negligence isn't just an isolated mistake. It can be so deeply embedded that it needs that top-down intervention, often pushed by public outcry. And, as our sources note, even global oversight bodies can fall short. They might miss or even rationalize away really obvious signals of abuse.
So what we're really seeing is that institutions, often linked through sharing knowledge globally, can actually spread these dysfunctional dynamics. A flaw in one place can ripple out widely if there's no critical reflection, no accountability.
Exactly. It becomes self-perpetuating.
And the impact clearly doesn't stop in childhood. What happens when these learned behaviors become part of the fabric of our professional lives when the kids grow up?
Well, that's when those invisible chains really become visible, I think. By the time children from a negligent system are adults, the behaviors they absorb, the coping mechanisms, they tend to solidify into workplace norms, even leadership styles.
Like in the education sector.
Yeah, think about educators who might have their own unaddressed trauma. They might unintentionally perpetuate cycles. A teacher who was maybe bullied as a kid might react with really authoritarian discipline. Or, the opposite, they might completely miss bullying signs in their students because they've sort of normalized that kind of aggression themselves.
And it sounds like this isn't just about individual teachers acting out.
No, it's often more systemic. In really disadvantaged areas, for example, without strong support systems, you see high rates of compassion fatigue. Teachers might start thinking, maybe unconsciously, oh, that's just how these kids are, normalizing really abnormal, concerning behavior. And troubled students just slip through the cracks. This can lead to this sort of unofficial culture in a school that subtly mirrors a dysfunctional family. You know, secrecy, maybe favoritism, punitive reactions instead of real empathy.
That's a chilling comparison. What about in healthcare or social services? You hear about medical gaslighting, right? Where doctors dismiss patient concerns, maybe psychologize them.
Yes, exactly.
That sounds incredibly similar to that DRVO denial we talked about, just in a medical setting.
It absolutely is. Our sources mention an example. Maybe a survivor of childhood abuse comes in with chronic pain. They might get labeled as difficult by a doctor who has some unconscious bias, and their reality, their lived experience of pain just gets invalidated.
And then there's the issue of medication.
Right. The over-reliance on medication for behavioral issues, particularly in child welfare. Florida's foster care system, for instance, has faced criticism for heavily medicating kids in lieu of therapy.
So it treats the child's behavior as the problem, not the trauma underneath it all.
Precisely. It's a symptom-focused approach that misses the root cause entirely.
And I imagine burnout and secondary trauma for the workers must play a huge role here, too.
They're massive factors. Burnout can lead healthcare workers or social workers to adopt this kind of hardened, detached way of interacting, almost as a shield. But in doing that, they might inadvertently model a lack of empathy to the very people they're trying to help just because they're overwhelmed and, frankly, desensitized.
Okay, and then there's customer service. Public-facing jobs where emotional labor is just constant.
Oh, yeah.
Workers often have to mask their true feelings, right? Which sounds a lot like that childhood masking we discussed, suppressing how you really feel to avoid a negative reaction.
It's a very similar dynamic.
And that whole customer is always right thing, where employees are basically expected to endure mistreatment. That sounds disturbingly like placate the abuser to survive.
It really does echo that dynamic.
You know, you think about those customer service calls where you feel like you're going in circles and somehow your complaint ends up being framed as your fault.
Absolutely. That dynamic, it normalizes incivility in public life. It contributes directly to mental health problems for workers. And it really perpetuates this kind of unacknowledged trauma in the service industry where accepting verbal abuse or manipulation as just part of the job becomes the norm.
Okay, let's circle back quickly to policing and the military. When those manipulative or even violent behaviors take root,
Hmm.
a kind of siege mentality can develop, where any criticism is seen as an attack. That sounds like the dysfunctional family again. Keep secrets, protect the image at all costs.
That's a very apt comparison. We saw elements of this, for example, with the Broward County Sheriff's Office facing intense public distrust after documented incidents of lying and abuse by deputies.
So when that kind of pattern is tolerated, what does it really mean for the next generation of officers and for the community?
It means that leaders who dodge accountability are effectively rewarding those negative, sometimes sociopathic, traits. They're implicitly teaching new recruits that bending the rules or abusing power is acceptable, maybe even necessary.
Wow.
And this links back to those global patterns, too, where the experiences and traumas of marginalized communities are often dismissed or ignored, feeding this really dangerous cycle of antagonism and mistrust between police and the people they serve.
So we're seeing this incredibly powerful cycle of intergenerational shaping. Adults basically recreating the dynamics they learned, often in workplaces where colleagues and norms validate it,
Yeah.
completing the circle of dysfunction.
Right.
But the most alarming part of this whole picture, I think, is how it seems to perpetuate itself across generations, across different social groups, almost like a behavioral pandemic spread through social learning.
It really functions like one, and we can actually break it down into a kind of cycle, maybe a 6-step process that shows how these patterns get locked in and become so hard to break.
Okay, what's the first step?
It starts with what we might call corrupted guidance, which leads directly to child trauma. This is where the authority figures, parents, caregivers, maybe teachers, use coercive or manipulative behavior. And the children, just trying to cope, adapt either by copying that behavior or by submitting to it, basically suppressing their authentic selves.
Okay, so the child adapts. How does that play out later?
Well, that leads to step 2. The child's adaptation means their pathology is hidden or ignored. The coping behaviors they developed, maybe being overly compliant, maybe acting out, they effectively mask the underlying trauma.
So people miss it.
Right. Outsiders might just see a well-behaved, but maybe anxious child. Or they see an antisocial teenager who's actually just acting out the violence or manipulation they learned at home. And our sources point out narcissistic or antisocial traits interact with collective denial. And if institutions betray that child's trust, it magnifies the trauma.
So if the institutions, schools, doctors, whoever miss those signs, or worse, reinforce the negative behavior, what happens then?
That brings us to step 3. Institutional failure leads to normalization. When the systems fail to respond appropriately, like a school ignoring bullying or a court siding with an abusive parent over flimsy claims, it sends this powerful message that the dysfunctional behavior is actually normal or at least acceptable.
And people just start accepting it.
Bystanders often internalize the abuser's narrative, or they just lose the will to challenge it. It really becomes a form of collective gaslighting.
Yeah.
Think about a community where intimate partner violence is common, but nobody intervenes. It just becomes normalized.
And then these children grow up carrying that normalization with them,
Yeah.
which I guess is step 4.
Exactly. Step 4 is adulthood and professional mimicry. These traumatized adults carry their learned behaviors out into broader society. They often gravitate, maybe unconsciously, towards workplaces or relationships that feel familiar, which means, often, dysfunctional environments.
And they set the tone for others.
They set examples, yeah. And this can lead to what the sources call mass behavioral mimicry. It's essentially a social contagion of trauma-driven behavior spreading through workplaces and communities.
And if nobody consciously breaks that pattern, it just keeps going.
That's step 5, intergenerational transmission. When these adults become parents themselves, the cycle just repeats, unless they make a conscious effort to break it. Their own parenting might swing between extremes, maybe overly harsh, maybe neglectful, compounding the trauma across generations. Our sources emphasize that interrupting these non-physical feedback loops is essential to prevent legal outcomes and intergenerational trauma.
Wow. And you mentioned this isn't just local, it goes global.
Precisely. That's the final step, step 6. Global network influence. In our connected world, these cycles aren't contained anymore. Global media, internet culture, transnational institutions, they can spread both the harm like glorifying narcissistic leaders or exporting flawed practices like those training programs we talked about.
Right.
But also, importantly, they can spread healing. There's actually a figure in our sources, a global network of cause and effect, that visualizes this. It shows how distorted behaviors flow from families up into institutions, then outward across society and global systems, creating these feedback loops that get really locked in by multiple layers.
That's quite a picture. It sounds almost overwhelming.
Right.
So what can we actually do? How do we even start to reverse this Mandela effect of behavior, this collective forgetting of what's healthy?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and it really raises another one. How do we foster what some call institutional courage as the antidote to institutional betrayal?
Okay, so what would institutional courage look like?
Well, our sources suggest some pretty concrete steps for institutions, things like implementing real, meaningful trauma-informed training at all levels, not just a one-off workshop.
Right.
Screening for manipulative tendencies, like those recommendations for Florida police actually looking for these traits. And critically, setting up systems that genuinely protect and listen to whistleblowers so those DARVO tactics just don't work anymore.
And what about at the community level? For everyday people?
It's largely about increasing awareness, helping people understand how trauma can show up looking like something else entirely. For instance, teaching educators and pediatricians the subtle differences between, say, autism and PTSD in children. That alone could lead to correct diagnoses and kids getting the support they actually need.
That makes sense.
And those global networks we mentioned, they can be powerful vehicles for change, too. International NGOs, aid programs, they need to make sure they're not exporting approaches that ignore trauma.
Instead, they could.
They could share best practices for early trauma intervention. They could support cross-cultural research. And we are seeing some positive signs, you know. Things like complex PTSD being included in diagnostic manuals now. Movements to ban using parental alienation arguments in court unless abuse has been definitively ruled out. The spread of trauma-informed care models.
Those are definitely promising steps.
But I keep thinking about how hard this must be to implement, especially when generations of professionals, teachers, doctors, police might be carrying their own unhealed wounds from these same systems. That's a huge and crucial point. You're right. Real progress might actually require something like collective therapy. Creating spaces within workplaces, within communities, where people can process trauma openly, instead of just perpetuating the silence around it.
And leadership has a big role.
Absolutely. Leadership have to model empathy and accountability to reset the norms. Think about the impact of a teacher admitting a mistake and apologizing, or a doctor truly validating a patient's chronic pain instead of dismissing it, or a police chief publicly holding abusive officers accountable.
Those actions would have ripples.
A huge ripple effect. They start to renormalize healthy behavior. They show that understanding and responsibility are supposed to be the default, not denial and attack.
And what about the next generation? The kids?
Critically, we have to empower the youngest generation. Teaching children in age-appropriate ways, of course, about emotions, about boundaries, about what healthy relationships look like. Things like social-emotional learning in schools, trauma-informed curricula. They can almost inoculate kids against harmful mimicry.
So they can recognize it.
Exactly. If a critical mass of kids grows up able to actually name and resist DARVO tactics when they see them, or if they know it's okay to seek help rather than just assuming abuse or neglect is normal, then the cycle can genuinely be disrupted.
Wow. What a journey this deep dive has been. We've really traced how this systemic negligence can shape kids' development, how institutions then reinforce those patterns, creating these deep-seated, almost invisible cycles of dysfunction that ripple out everywhere.
It's a complex web, for sure.
But the hopeful part, I guess, is that the same global connection that sometimes spreads the dysfunction, it can also be used to spread healing.
It absolutely can.
It seems like it just requires real honesty at every level, personal, institutional, global, to start breaking these invisible chains of coercion and trauma.
Honesty and courage, yeah.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. Consider for a moment. How might understanding these invisible chains change the way you interpret everyday interactions? Maybe that difficult customer service call or a news report about some institutional failure. What tiny shift could you maybe make just in your own sphere of influence to start renormalizing empathy and accountability?